Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presentation, The New Normal, Continuing Considerations of Hybrid and Remote Work. Today's presentation will focus on remote and hybrid workers and how organizations can best detect and mitigate risks associated with them. COVID-19 pandemic caused an unprecedented shift towards remote work. What started in 2020 as a temporary situation forced many employers to quickly adapt and build new work-from-home infrastructure. And that has resulted, for some, as a potentially permanent paradigm shift. Many employees now wish to remain working from home on a permanent basis, and some have even moved states during the pandemic, either with or without consulting their employers. This shift has created significant compliance risks for employers, which we will learn more about today. Before we get into today's content, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Zielinski, and I'm the Marketing Director of ComplianceHR. You may recognize my name from your email invitations, as I'm the one who you may have emailed with questions about today's presentation, which I always encourage. And on that note, today's presentation will be recorded and emailed to you once it's available online. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. We acknowledge it's not always easy to take an hour out of your day, especially during the beginning of the year when things are busy. Before I introduce the solutions that may support you best, I would like to introduce ComplianceHR. For anyone unfamiliar, ComplianceHR is a combination of two incredible and innovative organizations. Powered by the AI technology company Neota and the subject matter expertise of Littler, ComplianceHR delivers expert employment law guidance in a fraction of the time. Our goal is to simplify the complexity of employment law, something that we're going to learn a lot about during this presentation. If you frequent our webinars, you know that our goal is to simplify employment law like I just mentioned. And for those of you who are not yet clients, we have a variety of products designed with expert content to assist you in complying with employee handbook policies, wage and hour, paid leave, COVID, and other labor law requirements. Our objective is to help your compliance strategy be proactive instead of reactive. And to support that, I'd like to introduce you to our newest and our most popular solutions today. PolicySmart on the left is a comprehensive handbook solution that provides you with federal and state compliant templates, a compliance timeline handbook checklist, and even automated emails to alert you on new legal changes going into effect. The Reference Center is a new solution that combines many of our other rapid reference tools to quickly provide you with information on a wide range of compliance topics. You may be wondering, how does this relate to wandering and hybrid workers? Well, as you learned today from Libby, organizations must comply with the state in which the employee is working, even if the employer is not located there. So PolicySmart can provide you with compliant templates and handbook policies for all of the jurisdictions in which your employees are operating in. And Reference Center will help you answer new employment law questions that pop up as you navigate this difficult terrain. And finally, before I introduce today's presenter, I want to offer you the opportunity to register for a demonstration. So in the right-hand panel, you'll see a poll that popped up. If you don't see the poll, it may be because you're in full screen mode, so exiting that will permit you to answer it. Or it's also available in the hyperlinked URL in the links panel of the webinar interface. Our demonstrations are not a sales pitch. Our team will sit down with you, understand your organization's existing compliance strategy, walk you through some areas of optimization, and if they're able to streamline your workflows with our solutions, they will recommend the programs best suited for your company's needs. So this is really a great time to sit down and get a deeper understanding of how we can support your compliance strategy. Now, what we've all been waiting for, I would love to introduce you to today's presenter, Libby Henninger. Libby is a shareholder at Littler out of the DC office, focusing on litigation, compliance, and consulting on all aspects of federal and state wage and hour. Libby, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule for this presentation. I'm going to pass the mic over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'm so glad to be here to discuss this topic, and thank you so much for the opportunity to have me speak today. Thank you. Great. I just want to spend some time today walking through some practical considerations as we continue to adjust to the new normal and look to either extending those remote working relationships to our employee populations or embrace hybrid working. On the screen now is an overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover several key topics at a high level. I probably won't be able to answer all of your questions here today, but feel free to write your questions in the question box, and if we don't get to them today, we'll make sure that we follow up with you and hopefully can get you some answers. Also, so much of this depends, as Stephanie had mentioned, on state and local law. And the purpose of this presentation today is to identify those key considerations to evaluate as you're reviewing your remote and your hybrid relationships. As you go through here, if you are seeing that you continue to have compliance challenges, we welcome the opportunity to either consult with ComplianceHR or Littler with continued questions that you might have. But as we work through, I wanted to start with an example. If, like me, you experience some sense of fatigue when you look at these articles and kind of draw you back to where you were in March 2020, you're not alone. But it is important to recognize that the impact of COVID is still far-reaching and impacts how we work and what the workforce is now demanding. We've found that employees still want that continued flexibility that was garnered out of a requirement during COVID, but they also want those opportunities to connect. And we know that employers, as I hear, on a weekly basis, are fighting for talent that are requiring being flexible in working arrangements, which often leads employers to question the need for expensive offices that are sitting partially empty right now, as well as the need for developing more robust remote or hybrid agreements and reviewing where their employees are actually sitting and what laws might apply to them. So in that vein, I wanted for you all to meet Wallace. Let's walk through kind of an example of how this has been playing out since the pandemic. So Wallace, he's an IT professional, and he's working for a state university in this hypothetical state that we live in, State A. And State A, like 18 other U.S. states, does not have a separate overtime law. So it just follows the FLSA. And Wallace, he's exempt. He's an exempt computer professional, and he's paid by the hour as an exempt computer professional. When the pandemic hit, shortly after March of 2020, like many people and many organizations, the state university closed all of its IT offices and told its IT workers, hey, you can stay home and do your job remotely. And so Wallace works from home for about a week, but he decides he wants to go to his mom's house to help support her, and she lives in State B. And he doesn't tell his employer that he's going to go stay with his mom. But here's the problem, is that State B does not recognize that hourly paid exemption for IT professionals. Instead, it has exemption in which you'd have to pay someone on a salary basis. So what is the state university to do? He's there. He's been working now since March. Fast forward a couple of years, and he's still with his mom, and all of a sudden, he's now claiming that he should be paid overtime. Does he have a claim? He might. And he likely does, because he's now in a state that does not recognize the exemption that he was hired to work under. Different states have different requirements, and he might now be misclassified and might now need to be paid a minimum wage instead and overtime instead of the hourly wage that he is being paid now. And if he is in a state like California or Minnesota or the District of Columbia, where I'm sitting right now, or New York or some other jurisdictions, there might be wage theft notice requirements that would have triggered when he moved to that state and when he started working in that state that were not complied with. So these are all considerations that that pop up, and I'm sure many of you have been dealing with, either knowingly or unknowingly. But wait a minute. He didn't tell anyone about his move. So when he's now claiming that he's being paid incorrectly, is there something that can be done there? Well, I mean, part of the onus is on him, right, pursuant to your policies, to tell you where he's working, but most of it is on the employer to determine where those employees are performing the work. And really, from a jurisdictional perspective, and this is where a lot of the issues have been popping up, it doesn't really matter what he is telling you. It's really where that work is being performed, and if it's being performed for a certain threshold of time in that jurisdiction and meeting those jurisdictional requirements. And every jurisdiction varies a bit in terms of what is going to trigger under those state or local requirements in terms of application of those state or local laws. And so here, maybe he just goes to stay with his mom for a month or two. That might not actually trigger the state laws in some cases if he does return back to state A, but in some cases it might. And so it's really important to know where your employees are performing that work. But wait, it can get even more complicated because now, State University finds out about his move. Now they're allowing him to continue to work for State B. They figured it out. They fixed all those issues and said, we're going to properly classify you under State B's requirements, and we're going to do all the notices that are required under State B. We're going to treat you as an employee of State B. But then he decides, I'm going to go work for my sister's house, which is in another city in State B. And that city has paid sick leave requirements that the general state doesn't have, but the city has. And when he's there, his sister gets sick and he misses work 3 days to care for his sister, and he decides, hey, I'm basically living at my sister's house and they have a sick leave requirement, and so I would like to access the sick leave. Do you have to provide it? Depends. Again, it depends on how long he's been working in that or living at his sister's, and what the thresholds are for that city. But it's very important to figure out if he is working in a different location for a percentage of the time, how long that is and what those triggers are, because it can have these practical implications. And sometimes you don't even know about it until a state agency or a local agency sends you an inquiry wondering why you haven't paid them properly, which we've been seeing more and more action at the state and local agencies with regards to paid leave programs that employees are now claiming that they should have access to, but perhaps have not yet been given access to. Now, the CU also starts to withhold state income taxes pursuant to his residence in State B. And he complains. He says, what are you talking about? I don't want to have to pay state income taxes. There was no state income tax when I lived in State A, which is where the employer is based. I don't want to have to pay these taxes. Well, here, State U is absolutely correct. I mean, the default in withholding taxes is typically the state and where the work is being performed. It's the source income principle. So typically where that work is being performed is where you would want to tax the employee. Now, there might be reciprocity agreements with other states, or the employee might have personal income tax obligations that are not parallel with the employer's withholding obligations. But those are all ancillary issues to where the immediate taxation will be. So it is very important to determine where that work is being performed to ensure that those taxes are properly being withheld. And here you can say, well, it was your choice to move to state B, and we authorized you to move to state B, and so you're going to have to also pay your taxes to state B. And so this leads to the global question that I think we have to make sure that we're addressing is, where are those employees working? And it's all about where the employees are working is how you have to register the business. And you have to register those employees oftentimes. Because as we've just highlighted with Wallace's situation, the applicable employment law is most likely the law of the jurisdiction where that employee is working or spends a percentage of their time working. And so it's incumbent upon the employer to go through and do an audit and have procedures and policies that ensure that employees are informing the employer when there is a change in status, and that the employer is approving that, and that their employer is properly going through and making sure that everything that flows from that, including properly registering to do business in the state if required, has been accomplished. The longer that employee works in the state, the more likely that state law will apply. Same with jurisdictions. So the longer an employee works in a certain jurisdiction, certain city or state, more likely it is that that state or local law will apply. And some states have different triggers, so this is why there's not a one-size-fits-all rule. You can't just say, all right, well, if you've worked somewhere more than a week or a day or a month or 6 months, we're going to consider you to be an employee of that jurisdiction. Every state has a different trigger. We put in here an example where Louisiana has adopted, for example, a 25-day income tax grace period for remote workers. So if you're working more than 25 days in Louisiana, then you have to ensure that you're properly paying your income taxes. So that's something to be aware of. But every state has those different triggers. And so registering to do business accomplishes several things, but registration, importantly, will trigger certain requirements that affect the employee, including, like we've talked about, the taxation, but also unemployment, which can then implicate certain insurance programs. And as we'll talk about a little bit further in the program, that also has some implications for some of the evolving and newly implemented paid family leave programs. A lot of those run off of those employment tax filings, as well as workers' compensation and other reporting requirements. So different states have different requirements for reporting new employees. And there are definitely risks if you don't register. So of course there's the taxation issue, which should not be minimized. But also the workers' compensation. So if you don't properly sign up for workers' comp in a certain state and there turns out to be a workers' comp incident, that can result in some civil or criminal penalties, as well as the unemployment concerns if unemployment is not properly registered. We've been seeing an uptick in unemployment inquiries with the state agencies as well with regards to remote workers and inquiring about whether or not employees should be properly filing unemployment in certain states, as well as other fines and penalties for not receiving required notices under state law or otherwise enrolling in certain state programs or complying with certain state requirements that could subject you, particularly in audits, to fines or penalties. All right, so we've talked a bit about, with Wallace, some of the wage and hour compliance issues, but let's get into some more of those wage and hour compliance considerations. And I'm going to show you all a little vignette, a little video, and then we can talk about some issues that we can issue spot a little bit from some of the concerns that we see with this.
Good morning, Jamie. Thanks for calling in. How's everything going?
Good morning, boss. Hey, thanks for setting all of this up. Things are good. Yeah, I can't believe it's been over a year since I've been to the office. What's it like to be back?
Oh, it's okay. Pretty quiet, as you can imagine. A few people have started to come in, but it's just not the same.
I never thought that I would say this, but it's actually been pretty great to work from home. I'm more productive than ever. That part's going way better than I expected. I really do miss seeing everyone in person, though.
We miss seeing you too. These video calls just aren't the same.
One thing I don't miss, the Los Angeles traffic. I mean, sitting on the 405 for an hour or more every day. Oh, good riddance.
Oh, I know it. That's why I'm so glad that we're able to offer you and everyone else on the team this new permanent flexible work arrangement. You probably saw the memo. There's full-time back, full-time home, and hybrid.
Yeah, right.
Where
That's
you
really
can come
good,
in
Billy.
1 or 2 days a week.
Yeah. No, wait, right there. See that? Remember what your teacher said. I before E except after C. Yeah, I know it's weird, but that's the rule. Weird. W-E-I.
Jamie, is this
W-I.
still a good time?
What? Oh, yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, Billy just had a question about school. No, honey, your teacher can't hear you. You have to unmute, remember? There you go. I apologize. Sorry about that. Where were we?
Your options.
Oh, right, my options. I considered hybrid, but I think that I'm going to stick with full time at home for now. I mean, with Billy home from school, I think the hybrid model would just be too confusing for us. Maybe in a few months, I'll want to give hybrid a try.
Okay, sounds good. We'll miss you, but I totally understand. Like it said in the memo, there may be times when we will need you to come into the office. It won't be too often, but we think it's important for everyone to stay connected.
Totally understand. No problem.
Also, the same rules apply as if you were in the office. You need to record your time, no unauthorized overtime, all of it, just like if you were here.
Of course.
Great. Then let's plan on checking in every few weeks or so just to see how things are going.
Sounds good, boss. Take care.
All right, bye-bye.
Okay, so I might have dated, it might be a little dated because I'm hoping most of your children are back at school at this point, but I know that we are all a bit more compassionate to those interruptions. I'm sure that we've all had those calls where our dogs are still barking or the door's still ringing or children are still popping in before or after school. But it does raise some considerations when you are looking at pure remote or hybrid relationships as to how you want to define those. So here, clearly there are considerations that are identified, particularly if this person is non-exempt. But even if they're exempt, I mean, you'd want to make sure that you are clearly communicating hours worked and timekeeping policies and determining what specifies work and schedules and prohibiting work outside of that schedule, which I know Billy's supervisor was doing, but it's really incumbent upon the employer also to have written policies identifying that and having more frequent check-ins, I think, than every couple of weeks, particularly if there's going to be concerns about productivity, which I'll show you.
Good morning, Jamie.
Oh, hey, Brandy. Good morning.
So I just wanted to check in and see how the first month of official full-time at home was going.
It's great. The last year's been rough, but, making it official, I really felt like I could take back some control, settle in, get myself organized.
Yeah, it looks like you moved out of the kitchen.
Yeah. Once I knew this was going to be my new normal, I converted the spare room. I got a desk, set up a printer. Everything's all in one place. I got this sweet new webcam. I even upgraded my internet. It's like I was back in my old office, but the commute's way better.
Yeah, I'm sure. Things are changing here at the office, too. The flexible work options are so popular, we never have more than a third of our team in the office. So we decided to consolidate our space a bit.
Oh, wow. Already.
Yeah, we're giving up our lease on the third floor. Going to save a ton of money.
But the third floor, that's where my office is.
That's where your office was. We are converting the East Conference Room on the second floor to a shared workspace for when you actually need to come in. It's great. Those who are here full time will have their cube down on the first floor, and those who are hybrid will switch to a hoteling model and alternate days in their cube with other team members.
But what if I decide that I want to come back to the office? I change my mind.
I thought you were happy working from home. I mean, it's gotten so popular that we're even posting new positions to be work from home.
Oh, well, that's great. I am happy working from home. I mean, after all, I just got this new sweet setup organized, and I do have to say I'm not complaining about not having that office dress code.
And don't forget the commute.
Oh, no, no, I'm saving money on gas, parking, but mostly just having all that time back is great.
Yeah, right. Time. Yes. Speaking of time, I have noticed that I've been having a hard time reaching you during the day, and other times you've been sending me emails at all sorts of hours. I
Hey,
was wondering if maybe
boss, this
we
is
needed
not
to.
really a good time. I'm sorry, there's a thing that I need to take care of. Can we set up a time to chat tomorrow, like 2 o'clock? Good? Great. I'll
Sure.
see you tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay. So putting aside the the probably more in-depth conversation that his supervisor needs to have about accountability with him, there are some necessary wage and hour red flags that are popping up with this conversation that Billy just had with his supervisor. So one of the biggest areas of consideration that has emerged from the pandemic is what business expenses do employers have to pay? So we just heard that he has outfitted his entire home office where he's opted to work 100% remote at his own decision or choice with a variety of accoutrements, printers, and you saw he has the headset in, the earbuds in, and he had different things that were, desks and chairs, and he'd moved into a private office space. So what is an employer having to pay? I mean, we can see that the employer is reducing their office space because so many people have moved home and they're moving to this hoteling model. It really does depend. I mean, this is something that employers are still grappling with, how to deal with this, not just for remote employees, but for hybrid employees. So employees that are working part of the time in the office and then part of the time in a home office. There is no clear law on the issue. Most states follow the FLSA, and they don't have that robust statutory or common law requirement to reimburse for business expenses, so long as they're not cutting into a minimum wage requirement. They merely require reimbursement for home office expenses to the extent that those unreimbursed expenses would bring compensation below that applicable minimum wage. But there are some states, as you can see with the darker orange, that do require reimbursement for necessary out-of-pocket expenses that are incurred by employees to perform work, including teleworking. And we talk often about California as being the most restrictive, and this has served as a model for many others. And then we have those in yellow, where there are 3 jurisdictions that have statutory, those are the jurisdictions that have some statutory requirements that the employer pay the cost of providing certain tools or for certain equipment. It's not necessarily as robust as those in orange, but there are some requirements that you do need to take a look at. And then in red, we are observing a growing trend where it's not done by law, but really by court interpretation of deduction rules and expense reimbursement obligations taken together. And in some of these jurisdictions, Massachusetts being the most notable, suggests that failure to reimburse an employee for out-of-pocket expenses incurred on the employer's behalf is tantamount to not paying all wages due. And so with the telework movement growing, we are expecting and have seen an increase in claims and perhaps some similar interpretations elsewhere. But when you're looking at this, how do you kind of craft a policy? I mean, one thing is to look at what really is necessary. So what expenses are necessary, which are associated with telework, might not be necessary if the participation in them is optional and the employer makes the workspace and necessary equipment available. So earbuds or some other desk, additional desk space or multiple monitors, things like that might not be necessary if the basic requirements of an office are already provided. But I think it's very specific as to what the position requires and entails. And so some employers have opted to pay a stipend to work for home employees or hybrid employees. And really, that amount of the expense reimbursement we kind of look at as like the Goldilocks rule, because there are risks in paying too much, because if you pay too much, it's really a windfall for the employees and could turn into compensable wages. If you don't pay enough, it could amount to failure to properly reimburse or potentially cut into minimum wage. And so you really have to look at kind of what is just right and make sure that you're documenting that and tying it to actual or anticipated expenses. So expenses for average internet, cell phone, printer, stipend to buy equipment or provide the equipment yourself. And the other thing you should do, and we'll talk a little bit more about the policies and agreements for telework, whether it's fully remote telework or hybrid telework, but you really should have a delineated policy or agreement that sets out those requirements. But you really should have a section in there about expenses and what is expected that an employee has in their office, and make it clear what is voluntary and what's involuntary, what's required, what's provided, what the minimum requirements are, and identify with specificity the equipment and resources that are made available by the employer and what should be provided by the employee, and any requests for approvals for any purchases or stipends or reimbursements. And it should really be related to that reasonable cost or percentage if you are going to reimburse. And if you are going to reimburse, not directly for the amount that's incurred, but on some sort of stipend, there should be ability to appeal. And so when we say that, we mean we're paying you $75 a month or $50 a month to cover those reasonable and necessary expenses. But if you have an expense you think that exceeds that, there's an ability to request additional amounts, which you could require a validation with some sort of expense validation with a receipt or other documentation. Now, other things you want to take into consideration that when you're looking at employees being employed in different jurisdictions are that there are different wage and hour rules in different jurisdictions. I know this thing is kind of basic, but it's something that bears some repetition because some of these are pretty specific to certain jurisdictions and don't apply all places. And some of them also, if someone's moving from state to state and they have an overtime exemption. They're exempt, like we talked about that IT professional who's being paid hourly, because under federal law you can pay IT professionals hourly for all hours worked, but you don't have to pay overtime. You're going to want to check to make sure that that exemption holds up if they're going to move to a different jurisdiction, because that very specific exemption where you can pay hourly doesn't apply in all jurisdictions. Same with if you have someone that is non-exempt, so they're being paid just hourly. There are different minimum wage rates, and a lot of those were increased at the beginning of the year. And so you just want to be mindful of the different minimum wage increases or different rules about overtime. There's different thresholds in certain jurisdictions. The big one, of course, is meal and rest break requirements. There are certain jurisdictions that have very specific meal and rest break requirements and timing for meal and rest break requirements. So you'd have to take a meal break, before the 5th hour of work commences or something like that. And these very specific ones that are in a few jurisdictions, but they can have some implications, such as reporting time rules. So if someone gets called back to work, which could happen even with a hybrid or remote worker, that they are entitled to additional pay. Or if they work part of the day and then take a break and then work the rest of the day, for some workers, there are some premiums that might apply in those circumstances. And I will just say we have seen an uptick in litigation that is related to some of these COVID-related type claims, so expense reimbursement or off-the-clock work or classifications, because of people moving and workplace and population shifting. What are some solutions? So for non-exempt employees, again, coming back to this adopting this telework policy or agreement, it's really important if you're going to engage in these type of arrangements to have an agreement. This is something that you can review with outside counsel, but it really should have all of these things that are identified within it. You should define what is work, and a lot of this can be taken from your general policies, but it really should be specific to having some metrics to hold people accountable, because there is less oversight when someone is hybrid or working remotely. And setting expectations regarding those interruptions, as we saw with Billy. What are those expectations if you do have necessary interruptions that come up because you are working from home and you might have a delivery person or a repair person or something like that? How are you reporting that, and what are those expectations on taking those breaks? And should you be informing your supervisor if you need to go offline at any point, and how are you reporting that on your work schedule? And for all employees, as we'd mentioned, it's really important to identify the equipment and resources that are required and which ones are employer provided, and discuss expense reimbursement and have a plan for that lost or damaged property, as well as the return of equipment upon separation, which can be really difficult and even more demanding when you have employees all over the country when you haven't in the past. But having a clear plan when they're onboarded or now that they are working remotely or hybrid, an agreement about the equipment that they have and what the expectations are with regards to that equipment in terms of returning it if and when their employment ceases, and those procedures, both from the employee facing as well as internally understanding what those procedures are. Similarly, as we talked about, specifying whether the arrangement is voluntary or involuntary, whether the arrangement generally to work hybrid or fully remote is voluntary or involuntary. And this can be important too. particularly in the hybrid situation, when you have someone that is working a couple of days in the office and a couple of days at home, how you have to pay for, say, travel into the office if it's less frequent than a couple of days in the office. If they are in a hybrid situation but only reporting into the office on occasion, and what happens if that report time is a greater distance because they themselves have opted to live a greater distance from their designated work location. So it's very important how you're defining that, because a lot of that is going to drive how you have to pay them for either travel time or commute time, potentially, in those circumstances. And then reconsidering, as we'd mentioned, the exempt status if someone's moving. If they're an exempt employee, ensuring that that exemption is still applicable. And then taking into account those state variations, all applicable when you're looking at wage and hour considerations. So let's turn a little bit. I know we've talked a lot about the wage and hour world, but those aren't the only concerns that you might have when you're looking at your remote or hybrid workforce. The other big issues at hand, of course, are paid family and medical leave as well as other leave. So let's just kind of run through what those requirements are briefly so that you can start issue spreading and making some considerations as you're looking at these relationships. So many additional leave types are available at the state level. I'm sure that comes as no surprise to anyone. But the big thing that you'd want to make sure that you're cognizant of as you're looking at where employees are moving is not only what the leave requirements are, whether they're unpaid or paid, but also are there notices or other record-keeping requirements that apply. And I've seen that a lot. I sit in D.C., of course, as I've mentioned, and D.C. has both a paid family leave law, which is fairly new and has some notice requirements, and we also have a DC FMLA, and we have a DC sick leave, which has notice requirements and record-keeping requirements as well. And we have seen here at the local level an uptick in enforcement for employees that claim that they have not received proper notice. And there are penalties, just by way of example of DC, for not providing the notice that's required under some of these laws, even if you don't otherwise have a covered incident or covered event that would trigger taking leave under one of these laws. So here's an overview as to the differing mandatory paid leave laws, and they're really across the board. So you have kind of paid sick leave laws, paid family leave laws, and some of them apply at a state level, some of them apply at a city or county or local level, and they have different accrual requirements oftentimes if you're looking at a sick leave law, or some of them are PTO, which also has its own kind of mechanism for accrual or general caps, and some of them make it difficult to have a one-size-fits-all policy, but it is worth taking a look when you have an employee moving from one jurisdiction to another, whether or not more notice is needed, or whether or not you might need to increase or give a different type of leave. We've talked a bit about these paid family and medical leave programs. So these are fairly recent, but I don't think they're going away. I think this is the new trend, and we have several states that have been identified that currently have programs, and I expect that there'll probably be more states in the future that are going to be adopting similar programs. And basically they're insurance type programs that when you have a covered leave, they provide a portion of payment to cover that leave, like an insurance type, short-term type disability payment. they're run differently. So some of them are funded by the employer. Some of them are partially funded by the employee and the employer. They have different coverage levels in terms of what types of leaves are covered or what employees are covered or the time period that's covered or how much leave is covered. But generally speaking, when you are working in that jurisdiction, you're going to have to start either looking to see if you're going to have to pay into the program or provide notice for the program. And this is where, like I said, at least in DC, which does have a paid family leave program, we have been seeing a lot more enforcement of these type of programs, and I know other states have experienced similar. There are also states with separate disability insurance programs. And then generally, so aside from the paid leave, there are other leave of absence laws that are not as frequently utilized, but are also things that you have to take into consideration when employees are moving from state to state or jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And these are kind of the highlight of some of those that you see: voting or military leave or donation leave for organ donation or bone marrow donation. Sometimes you will see that there are school activities leave. So some states will cover employees who need to be absent because of a required activity from school or something like that. So just kind of clicking through some of the options. Actually, this one's already rolled off. This is not evergreen here, but these are just some of the categories of leave, just to give you an idea of if you're moving from one to another, what you would have to deal with. But the paid leave for the COVID-19 vaccination, I believe that rolled off at the end of December in New York. And just to give you a better sense as to what we're talking about here and how granular it can get, and we're not I don't mean to scare you about all of these state compliance laws, but these are just some of the updates that have recently gone into effect. That say you had someone who has now moved to California or Kentucky, now you're going to have to see if an adoption leave law, for example, is going to cover them, whereas before, if they were living in Texas, you might not have had to be concerned about that. And we're just providing you here with some more updates, just to give you an overview and just a sense as to how quickly these laws do change and kind of what those amendments might look like, so that you can have a little bit more awareness just of the different types of leaves that might be at issue. All right, so just to round out some other compliance challenges that we do experience. All right, so a big one, and we get this a lot, are now you have people that are working from locations that you don't control. So we saw Billy was working out of his kitchen for a bit, moved to a private office in his home, but you don't know what he's doing with the information or the property that he might be printing or might have access to. And so the best practice is for employees to have that separate space in their home. And that's something that, again, when you're looking at telework or hybrid work agreements, should be worked into the agreement, and something that you should be discussing with employees is where they're actually working and the physical security and information security that attaches to that workspace. Ideally, it should be a space with a door that locks, or that they have the ability to put their work laptop or their phone or their confidential information in a drawer that locks. There should be a mechanism to secure that information. And employees should also be instructed not to leave work equipment visible in vehicles or other public or semi-public spaces where theft is possible. A lot of this comes up with security information training or awareness, but it is something to be even more aware of when you, like I said, don't have full visibility as to where this information is being kept or stored. And again, printed materials should be directed, should not be disposed of in just normal household trash. There should be some sort of direction or mechanism to discard or shred that type of material so that it's properly disposed, whether it be sending it back to a physical location to be shredded or taken into a physical location to be shredded, or direction to have the employee buy a shredder to obtain that that same level of discarding the confidential information. And IT departments should also set out clear rules of use of equipment, so minimal personal use of devices when employees are working remotely. Practical considerations when you're developing that remote work or that hybrid work policy is that you are making sure that you're addressing the information and property security rules and expectations as part of that policy. And while it's difficult to separate work and personal time, there should be a significant effort given to separating work and personal equipment and materials. So you shouldn't be work stuff on personal devices, and you shouldn't be using your personal email for work-related communication. All right, another big one that, again, we are continually seeing some expansion of laws at both the local and the state level. And so as you're hiring people, and you're hiring people that could potentially be working anywhere, or they could be working in a hybrid location, so maybe your physical location is in one state, but they actually are working in a hybrid situation in another state, so you might have to consider both laws. Are these fair chance hiring laws? These are criminal background checks, or other background check laws, and just making sure that when you're doing so, you're complying with those laws, that you're ensuring that your applications and your background check requirements and your offer letters and your drug testing and all of that is being done both with the auspice of where the physical work is going to be performed, will be that at the physical work site, so your brick and mortar location, if that's an expectation, but also if there's a possibility that the employee, as you're hiring them, might be working remotely or in a hybrid situation, that those laws are also being considered too, and that you're kind of applying the least restrictive laws with regards to some of the fair chance hiring laws. The other big area that we've seen a lot of development in the past several years, and most frequently the past couple of years, are these wage transparency requirements. One area that we've seen development, of course, is the ability of employees to inquire about salary. So there are many states, 19 states in Puerto Rico, that regulate salary history inquiries for private employers. There's also a group of states that have started implementing wage transparency requirements. And some of these require employers to list, for example, pay ranges and benefits for every job opening. And this is really important because many of these laws will kick in if the position is or could be performed in that jurisdiction, meaning that if it is or could be performed remotely, So if you have a position where hybrid or remote work is an option for the position, then even if a position is not in Colorado now, but could be performed in Colorado, there's a potential that these wage transparency requirements might apply to job postings for positions that are, going out to people in all different jurisdictions. So it's just something that employers I know have been taking a closer look at in terms of trying to develop a multi-state or 50-state compliance on, but it's also something just to be mindful of as we, as employers, have tried to take a balance in promoting flexibility in recruiting and retention with some of these new laws with wage transparency that have been implemented. Similarly, with regards to things like AI in hiring, Illinois has a really restrictive law with regards to artificial intelligence and its use in hiring. And so it's one thing that you'd want to take a look at if you are using some of these tools, and they might apply to applicants. Again, even if the applicants are not directly being hired for a certain jurisdiction, if they could be working in a jurisdiction, there's some arguments that these laws might still apply. So it just really is important to kind of take a look at both your hiring practices as well as the most restrictive state law practices and see if there's a potential that they might be implicated with kind of a remote hybrid alternative as you're continuing to look at these options. Similarly with drug testing, of course, it's one of the biggest issues that states have been regulating is when you can test, how you can test, and what you can test for. And that's an entirely separate webinar, which I'm sure you can attend. But just to highlight the fact that if that is something that you are doing, if you are doing pre-employment or employment testing, again, what you can even test for or when you can test for it is really driven by where that employee lives, where that employee works, and what the reason for the testing is for, and what the reason for the use is. So it's something just to highlight as an issue. Okay, I'm just going to end with some practical solutions. I have 3 slides and some practical solutions, giving you a lot of high-level topics. But the biggest thing is ignorance is not bliss. So as I've emphasized throughout this whole presentation, it's really important and incumbent upon employers to figure out where everyone is working. And if they're not where we thought they were, why? So there is no excuse. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Ignorance of the work location of your employees is also generally not an excuse. So it's incumbent upon you to figure this out. And I have a lot of clients who are undergoing exercises right now to do audits of current locations of their employees because they want to ensure that with all the shifts that have gone on in the past couple of years, that they have a good understanding as to where everyone is located. And then make sure your remote work agreements and policies address that location. You can actually have tell us where you are is probably not enough, but you could actually have a requirement that while you embrace flexibility, you can put some limitations around it too. You could have a list of where employees can't work. If you don't want employees to work in California, you can say no, we're not going to approve an agreement to work in California because we don't want to comply with everything in California. And finally, just build and maintain your own checklist. Hopefully this is a good starting point for starting to build that out. But build and maintain your own checklist of licensing requirements, payroll, wage and hour, leave and absence, all of the requirements that we've kind of touched on today. And I'm happy to address any questions. I know that a lot of them come through, so I'm going to take a look at those and I can reach out and respond separately. And I know that there is a poll that's still running if you want to take a look and respond to that, but I really appreciate everyone that has attended today and hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.